What's up, man?
I'm not bothering you.
No. I mean, I don't do nothing but sleep all day. You know.
Oh, there you go.
I'm kidding, but I mean, I have it good. I work from home.
Right.
Yeah. So regarding the oral law, I never heard that it was lost during Babylon. First of all, the oral law doesn't mean that it was some way only kept in an oral fashion. That's pretty much impossible. It was written down in note form. Just like if you go to any courthouse nowadays, there's going to be a room with books and books that are for litigators and judges, not for the public. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the one who compiled the oral law, collected all these notes and made a manual for the everyday man. Although it was made for the everyday man, you still needed people who knew something to explain it. Mind you, all this is really a leap of faith. Not that a court existed, because we can prove from Tanakh that the court always existed. It appears in 2 Chronicles chapter 8, verse 14. It appears with Ezra and Nehemiah when they came back from Babylon. They had the men of the Great Assembly. In other words, by the simple fact that we have a Tanakh nowadays, who decided on that? There is no endorsement in the Torah for other books. In other words, there was a ruling body that decided, hey, we're going to compile these books, the writings and the prophets, and kind of link it up to the Torah to not forget about Jewish history and how God behaved throughout history. The oral law is not as big as people think it is, right? I mean, they think that everything that we do in Judaism nowadays is contained in the oral law. I would say maybe around 30 to 40% of what we do in Judaism nowadays is from the oral law. There's many customs that just crept into Judaism that really have nothing to do with Judaism, but people consider it part of Judaism. So the oral law is not that massive. I would say the whole Mishnah Torah, which could fit it all in a 2-pound book, is the whole oral law. And that's pretty small compared to law codes of today for civil societies. We believe that it was transmitted from court to court, but it was never written down as a definitive work till Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. Why? Because all these laws kept on changing. The court ruled like courts nowadays. In other words, one court could override a previous court, and this went on till there was no court because the temple was destroyed and Jews were scattered. So they decided to take the last batch of accepted opinions, and that's what we have in the Mishnah. And then we have the commentary to the Mishnah, which is the Gemara, and both of them make up the Talmud. But in terms of history, I would say it really only appears in Jewish rabbinic work or in the New Testament itself. The New Testament mentions Rabbi Gamliel. He's a Tana. He appears in the Mishnah. Josephus, in other words. So we can link it that far back. But I would say it's ultimately a leap of faith for us to believe that the rabbis in the Talmud are who they claim to be. In other words, members of the Sanhedrin. That's a great leap of faith. That is not provable. We know there was a court. The Romans and Roman historians speak about a court, a Sanhedrin. Josephus speaks about a Sanhedrin, and also mentions some of the people that appear in the Mishnah. But before Josephus, I don't think you're going to find non-Jewish historians speak about the inner workings of the Jewish judicial system, which is basically the Torah, Eretz Yisrael system, outside of Jewish literature. That's pretty much it. The problem that people have with the oral law is that people over-mystify it. And then it makes it a hard pill to swallow for many. Because they're thinking, like, you know what? If this is man-made, how could you apply anything mystical to it? I mean, these are just dry laws, right? Don't do this, don't do that. Right? And this is why I always make a distinction. I tell people, anything metaphysical or mystical that may appear in rabbinic literature is opinion. Like if you wrote something, you know how many people have encounters with UFOs every day, right? I mean, only because it appears in the National Enquirer, that doesn't mean I'm going to believe it. Some people do. There's a certain portion of the population that still believes Elvis is alive. Okay, fine. These things, you can either accept it or not accept it. However, in Deuteronomy chapter 17, it tells us that God established a court. And this court, we see, existed all through Tanakh. However, the individuals in the Talmud, it takes faith to believe that those individuals are the remnant or the members of that actual court. It's like anything in history. It comes to a certain point that it's really faith. which is not a bad thing, because I think that Judaism needs some sort of ruling body to keep them progressing in a uniform manner. If everyone was going to interpret Scripture how they saw fit, it would be chaos. I had some lady call me the other day. Some Karaite teacher was telling her it's good to marry a bisexual woman so that she can have women on the side, and then you could have threesomes and all this stuff. And of course, the Torah doesn't prohibit this. So from a Karaite perspective, if the Torah doesn't prohibit it, it's something that we should encourage, which is kind of completely ridiculous. From a rabbinic standpoint, the Torah may not prohibit lesbianism, but the oral law clearly does. It shows that the oral law fills in the gaps and keeps us from becoming an immoral society. Not that lesbianism is immoral, but it's clearly unholy. So there's many cases that the oral law makes our life easier. The oral law is not a bad thing. The thing is, many of these Karaites are former Christians. So when they think oral law and rabbis, they think the Pharisees. It's not true that the rabbis of the Talmud were necessarily the Pharisees. The Talmud says there were 7 groups of Pharisees, and they didn't all agree with each other. It's hard to pinpoint and say that the rabbis of the Talmud are the Pharisees. And not that the Pharisees were necessarily bad. It seems that even according to the New Testament, the Pharisees were on Jesus' side, and it was the Sadducees that they were warring against. But regardless, this is just legal issues. It's not anything spiritual. For sure, if you find anything in rabbinic literature that goes against a Torah command, don't do it. Mm-hmm. And it says in Exodus, I believe, chapter 20, verse 23, don't follow the majority to do evil, which tells us that we should follow the majority to do good. So only because the court tells you to do something and it's wrong, then it's a mitzvah to break a halacha. But you're not going to find that. I mean, you're not going to find stuff in the Talmud that tells you could steal on Tuesday and rape on Wednesday, right? You know,
right. Yeah.
Although Karaite people are always, they'll be like, oh, well, like they're starting the holiday on this day and that day, and they'll read it not even knowing Hebrew, and they'll say, see, they're perverting the Torah. Now, something ceremonial that could be taken either way may be a mistake. It may not be a mistake, but to say it's an intentional, divisive, demonic attempt to override Torah is only something that someone who came from Christianity, who never got over this whole Pharisees are bad thing, could have come up with.
All right. Like I said, I'm a historical person. I don't believe something. If I don't see it, then I don't really I have to dive into it. That's the type of person I am.
We're still dealing with religion, man.
Yeah.
It's faith ultimately. The question is, how much faith does your religion require you to have? If your religion requires you to have too much faith, then that makes that religion questionable. Why? Because with too much faith, you could justify anything.
Yeah.
So the oral law, which I believe are just the rulings of this court, are here to help us progress as a people in an ethical fashion. That's it. God doesn't necessarily kowtow to these laws. There's Torah law and there's rabbinic law. The rabbinic is there to amplify the Torah law. It's not the other way around. Mm-hmm. So if you find that it's not doing that, then I would tell you don't keep it. But that's not the case. I mean, that's not the case. Right. Would you allow me to put this phone call online, because I think it'll help a lot of people? They don't know who you are, and I won't put you on.
That's fine.
Yeah.
I guess my question is, like you said, what was his name, Yehuda Nazi?
Right.
He added all the notes. So how do you know? So you're saying by faith, we think those notes were passed down. Like faith.
Oh, well, there's faith in that also, but we have the notes. The notes are what appear in the Mishnah. They're basically sayings of rabbis here and there. So we know that those notes exist. Could they all have been fabricated in the year 800? All right, now, mind you, the Mishnah was compiled in the 4th century. Yeah, I mean, this whole thing could be made up. The question is, does it help more than it hurts? And that's really the test of any religion. We're not saying that these notes are divine. We're saying that it's part of Judaism because it makes us progress. Torah is the basis. Now, if you ask a Kabbalistic rabbi, he'll say everything in the Talmud was given on Mount Sinai. The Kabbalistic approach is to try to mystify everything legal. That's a clear adding to the Torah, to say that something additionally was given on Mount Sinai. Now, I believe there may have been certain things that were given on Mount Sinai just out of faith. Then we have this idea called Halach LaMoshe Sinai, that there were certain halachot that were given on Mount Sinai. Just because the Torah is not clear, the Mishnah doesn't really give a source for when this law was developed, so someone could assume that it may have been given on Mount Sinai, but you don't have to believe that. Because regardless, those laws still came to us through the Sanhedrin. Yeah, it's really how you explain things, because, he would have a huge problem just going through a page of Talmud. In the Talmud, they're always making a distinction between what's rabbinic and what's in the Torah. Constantly, and the Talmud tells you that in application, we also make a distinction that if we have a question on a rabbinic law, we have to be lenient on its execution. But if we have a question on a Torah law, we have to be strict, right? So it depends. If you're getting your knowledge from Chabad.org, then yes, you're going to get a lot of weird things like that. Just because Hasidic movement is really an attempt to spiritualize the legal with good intentions. They're not trying to harm Judaism, but I think ultimately it hurts it for the academic mind. But in a more yeshivish environment, they always make a distinction. It's the only way you can really poskin, and that's the only way that you can really develop practical law, by weighing out rabbinic law against Torah law and personal opinion. All
right. Well, yeah. Thank you, man. That's, that helps. I just, the history thing is just, I know there's evidence of like Daniel praying 3 times a day, stuff like that.
Well, that is also a good point, is that the notion of praying 3 times facing Jerusalem appears nowhere in the Torah. The Torah doesn't tell you to face Jerusalem. There are many things in Tanakh, like not buying and selling on the Sabbath. That's something that's outside the Torah. It appears in the books of the prophets, but we know that no one is allowed to add or take away from the Torah, with the exception of this group of elders that appears in Deuteronomy 17 and other places in Torah that are allowed to establish rules to guard Torah. So that's the only way it could really be explained. Yeah, I think that example in Daniel is a good example. There's a bunch of other examples of laws that appear in the books of the prophets that don't appear in the Torah. So there clearly had to be a ruling body deciding this, just like there was a ruling body adjudicating people who broke these laws. So, yeah.
Okay. But and another thing, when I said that I thought everything was lost when they got exiled from Babylon, was that just the Torah that was lost? That was,
I think you're thinking of the time of Josiah.
I think so.
So King Josiah, it said that the Torah was found, or a Torah scroll was found. So the understanding is that Moses wrote 13 Torah scrolls. I believe it was 13 Torah scrolls before the Torah ended in Deuteronomy, towards the end of Deuteronomy. So the understanding is that he found one of those Torah scrolls. But to say that the whole law was lost, and even the Karaites who make that sort of argument don't say it's referring to the oral law. They say that the Torah was lost, which is really nonsensical to believe that the whole Torah would have been lost. Mind you, it was a commandment for every Jewish male to write a Torah scroll in his lifetime.
Yeah, right.
So which means that, Torah scrolls would have been as plentiful as AK-47s, lahavdil. So...
Yeah, and the king had to write 2 of them.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, so it's kind of silly, to even believe that.
True. Yeah, to think about that. Yeah, that's true. So, the Babylonians didn't take away everybody from Judah. They left the poor and some other people.
Right. The vast majority of people actually stayed behind, but they took the brightest. Right. They took the brightest people up to Babylon.
Okay.
Right, which is why when Ezra returned, he told the people to divorce their pagan wives. If they didn't want to convert to Judaism, to divorce them. In other words, he came back to a people already living there who were of Jewish descent.